Danse. Good afternoon. I'm Gregory Scofield. I'm a Métis from Manitoba. Very honored to be here. Very honored to be in the company of many, many fine artists here. People whose work I followed over the years. People whose work I've taken inspiration from. People whose work I continue to learn from. Very insightful panel. Before lunch. It's always wonderful participating and listening to a dialogue. For me, really about storytelling. I was thinking a little bit as the panelists were speaking this morning and talking, taking the 10 minutes to talk about their presentations. I was really thinking about the idea of monuments and the significance of monuments, and of course, as a writer, primarily a poet, I always kind of end up in these precarious situations of where I end up with actors, I end up with musicians, I end up with dancers, I end up with painters, and now I'm ending up with visual artists, and I always wonder what the hell I'm doing there. And one of the things I was thinking about as the panelists were talking this morning, or the panelists were talking this morning, is I was thinking about monuments, of course, that's why we're here. I was thinking about monuments as resistance, monuments of reclamation, monuments of places of pilgrimage. I know for me, I've used monuments as places of pilgrimage. Monuments as places where we honor our dead, where we honor our history. And monuments as places that give us permission to memorialize and celebrate our environmental connection to place, our spiritual connection to ourselves, and to our Ntanskutapanak, which in Cree is our ancestors. I also think about monuments as really, for me, I'm not a visual artist, but I'm an artist that I try to work with words. I try to use words to paint pictures. I try to use words to sculpt things. I try to use words, I guess, to make monuments. I use poetry to make monuments. So of course for me, language as monuments are, poems are visual markers. Witnessing. Stories are physical connections. And really monuments are testimony in a way. I think that the idea of monuments as testimony is really important. I was thinking about what I wanted to share this afternoon just to kind of get things going, and there's one piece that I'd like to share with you. It's from a collection of poetry called Kepochigan. And this particular piece that I'll share with you today, really all I need to tell you about this piece is that this is a piece about my chapanak, my Ntanskutapanak kokumak. So my grandmothers of long ago. These are my Cree grannies that originated from York Factory. These were the country wives of my grandfathers of that generation, the Hudson's Bay men that came from places like England and places like Orkney Island. And when I was looking at my family, as one of the panelists was talking about this morning with Métis identity, when I was looking kind of at my family, of course, there was lots of information on the grandfathers of a long time ago, but there was no and very, very little information on the grandmothers of that time. Really, the only information that I could find about them is, their information would follow all of this information about the grandfathers, and it would simply say, married Indian woman Charlotte, married Indian woman Christiana Cree. And if I was lucky, there would be, a date of, when this grandmother had passed on. I got thinking about these grandmothers, and I found myself in conversation with them. I was lucky because I grew up with the Cree language. I grew up with the sense of the sounds of Cree, and I grew up with stories in Cree. So when I began to talk to the grandmothers, I, of course, began to talk to them in Cree. And the reason I'm sharing this poem with you today, and why I want to share this poem with you today, is because I hope that you're able to envision, you're able to see this poem as a monument. This is my living monument to my grandmothers, that the only thing that is left of them are the names that they were given. That's the only thing 5 generations later that I have. So this is the monument that I created for them. It's called Prayer Song for the Returning of Names and Sons. Yahweh, 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 ha, Yahweh, ha, Yahweh, 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 ha, Yahweh, how, Yahweh, Yahweh. Hoy ha lam, hoy ha. Ahaw in Chapanak, Charlotte, Sarah, Mary, Egwa Christiana. Ahaw kaya so chinigawimak natuta, my song. Nigamuin ho, this song I am singing to give you back the polished swan bones, the sewing all, the birch bark bundle holding the whetstone, the drawing stone, the pounding choke cherry stone. Ho, the spirit of your Esqueo names, the ones not birthed from the belly of their ships, not taken from their Mantoe Masanagan, ho, their great naming book. In Chapanak, Charlotte, Sarah, Mary, Egwa, Christ, Anna. These are the names I have thrown back across the water. I have given back to their God who has 2 hearts, 2 tongues to speak with. How natuta, my song, negamuin, the renaming song I am singing 5 generations later. Natuta, my prayer song, so you will be called, sung as, tattooed from the lip to the chin woman. Hey, hey, sung as she paints her face with red ochre. Hey, hey, sung as charm woman who is good to make a nation woman. Hey, hey. I give you back in Chapanak the names to name the names of bones. Oskana, you laid down to build them a house. Ho, the blood, Miko, and warm earth skin, Aski, that built them an empire. Natuta, my song, Nigamuin, this prayer song I am singing to bring back your stolen sons, whose sons and their missing bones are unsung geese lost in a country across the water. In Chapanak, I have thrown back your names. Namoy Kioao, Charlotte, Sarah, Mary, Egwa Christiana. Namoy Kakyao Munyaskowak. Ahaw, in Chapanak, kaya so chinigawimak. Natuta, my song, nigamuin, this prayer song I am singing. Hey, hey.
Sorry, I should mention that we've had another change of plans. Neil McLeod cannot be with us right now, but that doesn't mean that Steve Loft can't carry on for us in a wonderful manner. Thank you, Steve, for jumping in like this. And he's just going to give a basic outline now to the next panel discussion.
Thanks, Wayne. I am Steve Loft. I'm Ganyanga Haga, the Haudenosaunee. It's my pleasure and honor to be here, to be on this territory. I acknowledge and thank the elders, ancestors, and my brothers and sisters of the Siksika, and There was a time when a little Mohawk kid probably wouldn't have been as welcome here as I have felt, so I thank them for not chasing me off their territory. I am your emergency replacement moderator. I'm not Neil McLeod. I wish I was as smart as Neil McLeod was, but he got called away. So I'm just going to kind of be a little bit of an MC here as opposed to a moderator. And I just want to reflect a little bit on what we heard this morning, because I was just so incredibly inspired by everybody this morning. So I want to thank everybody who spoke this morning, and to thank them for really amazing words and challenging, and including those people who asked such good questions. I'm really so thrilled about this gathering. Whenever we gather, I'm always inspired, but you know, we need to take on these tough issues, these challenges. So our panel this afternoon is called Your History is Not My Memory, What's Been Forgotten? And I'll just read out this. It's, for every story that gets told in the official public sphere, another 1,000 stories go untold. Monuments, by their very nature, make certain stories permanent, thereby preempting the telling of other stories that might contradict them. What has been forgotten on account of our monuments, our urban plans, and our architecture? Jimmy Durham wrote, every memory stick will tell you that the main practical function of a memory stick is to remember only a tiny amount of the story that should be remembered. Beyond specific stories, how have certain ways of knowing been affected? And I'm very happy to say that we have an incredible panel with us today. Starting from my far left, Laurel Reuter, who is the founding director and chief curator of the North Dakota Museum of Arts, and somebody I've just met. And our elder this morning reminded me that we need to personalize. We need to personalize what we do. And I'm, as I said, your emergency moderator, so I do encourage you to read the full bios. But some of these panelists I know, and some I've just met, and I've just met Laurel, and she has an amazing history of working with art in Canada and the United States. Take her out for a couple drinks and get her to tell some stories, and ask her about the Blue Bombers. That's all I'm saying. So I also invite them to talk a bit about themselves. Next to Laurel is Sandra Semchuk, who I do know, and who is one of the kindest, most generous people I have ever had the honor to know. She's an artist, a collaborator, somebody whose work has had a profound influence, and whose work with her partner, who's passed now, James Nicholas, I know had an incredible effect on my work. And so I thank her for being here. Richard William Hill. He's one of the smartest people I know. And I know lots of smart people. He's an artist, a scholar. He's a professor at York University right now. He was my partner's PhD advisor, so I have to be nice to him.
Now I understand the compliment. Thank you, Steve.
And I've always been taken by an intellect like Richard's, and he challenges me in so many ways. So thank you for being here. Geir Holm is another person I've just met. It's a pleasure to meet you. I know your work. It's wonderful to meet you. Geir is Sami, and is currently a research fellow at the Oslo National Academy of the Arts. Ooh, my memory is not as bad as I think it is. As I say, I do know your work from when we did Close Encounters, which I had the pleasure of working with Candace Hopkins, who's here, and also Leanne Martin and Jenny Western, who aren't here. I wish they were. So thank you for being here, and I'm looking forward to your talk. And Marcia Crosby, who is a brilliant thinker, an artist, who has written some of the most seminal texts about Indigenous art, certainly in this country, and who's now completing her PhD and doing a bang-up job of it by all accounts. And I'm looking forward to reading that because I know I'll have another thing that I can quote ad infinitum. I did want to sort of just end with something because I think it was so inspiring to hear Jimmy Durham today. And I recalled something that I quoted him on once, and luckily I found it, that I think speaks to this issue and what this panel is going to be talking about. And Jimmy once wrote, "We are from the past, but we echo and reverberate in the present. What a responsibility. it is necessary that with great urgency we all speak well and listen well. We, you and I, must remember everything. We must especially remember those things we never knew. Obviously, that process cannot begin with longer lists of facts. It needs newer and much more complex kinds of metaphors. And I think that that's what we're talking about creating. New metaphors, new languages, new ways of thinking about monumentalization, memorialization. But do we need to be caught in that colonizer's language? I don't think so. So I invite our panelists to discuss those and many other issues. And since I get to be the moderator, emergency moderator, I get to choose who goes first. So I'm going to start from the left and ask Laurel to speak.
I knew he was going to do that. Oh, yes, and I'm single if anyone's interested. Wasn't that a great presentation, a great line? And I believe in stories. I believe that monuments must speak to the heart. They must move you, or they must make you smile, or they must provoke new ideas or new understandings. A few years ago, probably 10 or 15, I don't remember, I was coming back from Europe, and I got on the plane. It was absolutely packed. In those days, I'd fly into Winnipeg and then go down to Grand Forks from there. And I got to my seat, and oh my, a woman with 3 kids had taken over the whole aisle. And I stood there a moment, and then a man behind the woman said, "Sit here." There was an empty seat by him. And so I sat next to him, and he said, "You'll be glad you did." And those kids were totally out of control. They weren't just having earaches, they were being bad. And the guy next to me, it turned out that he was an enlisted officer in the US Army and was coming out of Germany. And he said, "Those are my kids, that was my kid. He'd have had a rum and coke a long time ago." So this was a man, we started to chat, and it got around to what he does. And I asked him if he'd ever been to Washington, if he'd seen the Vietnam Memorial. And he said yes. And then he hesitated. I said, "What did you think?" And he got quiet, and he said, "It made me cry." This was a very tough man. And I've always thought that that's the most important piece of public art that was created in the United States in the 20th century. And it was important at that moment. It involved every one of us. We saw ourselves in the reflected granite. We brought flowers to the name of the person that we had lost. It lasted 3 generations. And by the time it hit great-grandparents, it doesn't resonate anymore. And so, in the same way. And so the people that cared about it, the original people, are now working hard to turn it into a place that memorializes all war. And so they've got an information center, and they're raising money again. And I'm going to be watching very carefully to see if a memorial like that can last, how long it can last into the future and still be living. A second memorial that stayed in my mind, in my heart. A year ago, or 2 years ago in January, I was on a Land and Literary Fellowship in Marfa. And if we saw Marfa this morning, and it's a place where money has built a great memorial to minimalism, but also to the arts and to what life could be like. And because we had a month, I crossed the tracks, and on the south side of the tracks, where the Spanish people live, there's another memorial. And it's a small building. It used to be a Catholic school, and the neighborhood is turning it into their own center. And as you walk in, or as you walk onto the grounds, there's a cross, and I don't think it's more than maybe 2 feet high, and there's a mound of earth in front of it, and a small plaque. And the plaque says, that this was where if children wrote a word of Spanish on a piece of paper and it was found, they had to take that piece of paper and the whole class would go, and they had a ceremony where they buried it. This memorial made me cry. I come from North Dakota. I grew up on a Sioux reservation, and I knew a lot about how we removed the Sioux language from their own people. But I didn't know that it extended to Spanish as well, and probably to many other languages. It's a modest memorial. I think it's the most important thing in all of Marfa. And the center is being rebuilt with the people's own money, not with all the big money that's flowed through that little town. And I like the town. I love the bookstore. The food is wonderful. All of the art, the theater. The third memorial is, I saw it on a cell phone. A friend of mine had been traveling in Europe, and I think in Germany, and she and her husband wandered behind some buildings, and they found a cemetery for memorials. And all the statues that had been torn down, they were all just scattered about. And I thought, what a great piece of public art. I'd like to have that behind my museum, and maybe behind this conference. It was only a cell phone image. I don't know where it was, but I'm going to find out. Recently, I've been faced with a new memorial that's only 100 miles from me. Lake Bemidji, a small community, maybe 10,000 people, many lakes. And a friend of mine is head of the Public Art Commission over there. Could we start with the images? Oh, we've got one. We don't know when this came about, probably in the maybe 30s or 40s. And it's in honor of Chief Bemidji. And he died in 1905. And he was beloved by all of the residents. He was able to negotiate between the two cultures, the Ojibwa culture and the settlers. And he was respected for his kindness and his wisdom. When he died, there was a huge service in the city hall, and then he was buried in a public cemetery, and hundreds of people made the walk to the cemetery. During the funeral, his family sat on the stage. And so this is a piece of folk art. No one knows who made it, probably made by a group. And do you want to go through some more? This is a smaller version. These were very small images. And this is Chief Bemidji looking out over Lake Bemidji along the shore where there's an art center. And there's another great piece of public art, Paul Bunyan and the Blue Ox, which had to do with the lumber industry. And next, and again. And this is the second memorial. What happened with the first was it was beginning to deteriorate, and so someone covered it with a resin, and the features began to disappear. And again. And so a couple, 3-4 years ago, they decided to make a new memorial. And they ultimately were able to gather about $70,000. And they made a committee of 10 of the white population and 10 of the Ojibwas. And the family, many members of the panel sat on that committee or were from the native families. I was very surprised when I saw this because what they chose to make was a bronze statue of Chief Bemidji. And that's such an archaic way of making a contemporary piece of public art that I didn't quite know what to think. We have several more images. And this is the chief, and here, notice here he's wearing a Western tie. And once the family saw that, they said, oh no, he wears a kerchief. And so that has been replaced. These are just studies. And would you just go back one more, please? We'll hold it there. It was interesting to me that one of the family's reasons for loving it and wanting it is that they saw, oh, Johnny looks just like him. Or they could see the features being passed on in the family. And again, you wonder, how long does it take before the features are diluted by many more genes? I don't know. And if I were in the situation of being asked to make a bronze statue as a contemporary public piece of art, I don't know what I'd do. I don't know how I would make that decision. So the question always becomes, who has the right to choose? And I believe the people do. I don't know that the artists have the right to choose, but the artists have the right to be chosen. And if we could expand our concept of what a memorial is, there would be lots of room for artists. But it must speak to the people. It must speak to the heart. I forgot to look at what time I started. Have I got 3 more minutes? Sure. I've got 3 more minutes. Thank you, sir. I got someone on my side. I have been doing a lot of thinking in the last day and a half. What a wonderful opening up of the mind a thing like this could be. And as I thought back, I thought about my own work in my own museum. And that actually I've used the idea of memorial several times in major exhibitions. Periodically, my audience says, why do you always have stuff that makes me depressed? So I give them a really beautiful show. I work hard at making a very beautiful show, and then I can go back to doing what I please for a while. And a few years ago, or maybe quite a while ago, back in the late 80s, I toured an exhibition throughout Asia, throughout the Pacific Rim, and it was introducing contemporary fiber into these ancient textile cultures. And it was sponsored by the USIA, United States Information Agency, and it ended up in China. We were installing when Tiananmen Square blew, and so it didn't open. But I came back to the States. I was building a museum, and I was going to Asia every 3 months, and jet lag. Every time I turned around, I hated it. And I got back, and I thought, I don't know what's going on in Latin America or in South America, in all of South America. I'm going to go just look. And in those days, the only way you really, the work entered this country, the United States that is, was through the Miami Art Fair and through Photo Fest. And so I went to those, and then I began just going around and looking. And I kept seeing an odd work here and there about the disappeared. Didn't know what that meant even, except the New Yorker had run an article in 1981, and I thought back to that. And it was about the governments killing their own, military governments killing their own people during the late decades of the 20th century. And also about all of the indigenous people being killed, kidnapped and killed in countries like Colombia and Guatemala. And so I'd see a piece and it would interest me greatly. And so I thought, I don't know about this. I don't think my audience knows about this. I'm going to look into it. And I began with the literature, fabulous literature coming out of South America about those years, wonderful fiction, wonderful poetry. And I got to the point where I couldn't read it anymore. I woke up one morning and I had dreamed I murdered my cat. And I thought, you better clear your mind somehow. So I went out and bought a pile of books, things like Seabiscuit and books that I would love. And but the show proceeded, and I set some guidelines for myself. I would not take someone with a Yale master's degree or MFA making art about a subject that was way out there. I wanted artists who had lived it, either in the aftermath or through it. And I wanted work that spoke visually. I wanted visual art because we were crossing language. And so, would you bring? I'm going to just show you one piece. And this was, whoops, wrong one. Go the other way. Go back, yeah, this is it. 13 artists in Argentina got together and they decided that they would help the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo find their children. And if you don't know the story, what was happening was that throughout Guatemala, Uruguay, the military and the police were snatching off the streets or out of the houses young people, and they were looking for pregnant women in particular. And they were the students, they were intellectuals, they were writers, they were poets, they were people who opposed the military. And they would put them in detention, and they would be tortured, and ultimately most of them would be shot up with some barbiturates or something and dropped out of airplanes into the water. But if you were pregnant, you were held until you delivered, and then you were killed after you delivered. But the baby was snatched from you, and it was given to the opposition to raise. Military, police, government officials, people who believed in the side of the right. I don't know that right and left fit in this situation. And they were raised as though they were their children, because if I kill you, I've killed you. But if I killed your child, I've killed your belief. And that's what they were doing. And so these 13 artists gathered, and the mothers then began to search for their missing grandchildren. And then the grandmothers began to search. And so what they did in this piece is they would get a picture of the mother at that age when she was taken, and a picture of the father. And this was many years later that they made the memorial. But it was an active memorial. And in the middle is a mirror. And underneath is simply a label that says, the daughter of so-and-so, or the child of so-and-so. And if they knew if it was a male or female, they had that. Where the child was where the baby was taken, the dates, if they had them. And they installed the show first in Buenos Aires. And when it opened, 3 people found out who they were because someone recognized their facial features and said, oh, that's Johnny. And so the word would go back and they would be found. Now, this memorial is meant to disappear. And every time a child was found, now a grown-up, they would be taken off the wall. And so I added this to the exhibition. It was a very, very important part of it. And it ran on and on and on and on. There were 250, I think at least, maybe close to 300 of these images in the beginning. And the show ended up touring throughout 5 of the South American countries. And if a child was found during that time period, it became international news. And so it was one of the most wonderful living memorials I've ever seen artists make. And the second, and I will quit right after this, either forward or backward. Yes, this one. After 9/11, we began thinking about the internment camp in Bismarck, North Dakota, and how none of us knew anything about it. And the fact that some of us thought it was a POW camp. And so I worked with the curators at the State Historical Society, and we did the research, and then we looked for images, and all we could find were government images that had been taken in the camp. They were official, and it looked like a picnic. They had a ski jump, they skated, they did all these things. And the camp was for German and Japanese men. It was all men. And there was lots and lots of pictures of the Germans, and there was nothing about the Japanese. So I had 2 strokes of luck. I found a Japanese poet who was interned there for 18 months, and he wrote haiku. And the haiku became the wall text. And if I can remember some of it, it was very simple. I am leaving, but the sun-drenched child doesn't know. I am leaving, but the sun-tanned child doesn't know. Another, the war has ended, but I'm still in the snow country prison. And so I took the idea of the monolith and went to Hawaii, where there's a very wealthy Japanese man who had been interned in North Dakota. And he was a gregarious man. People gathered around him. And he agreed to give me a picture of himself at that age. And so I was able to gather a lot of pictures. And these were young men in the camp. And we put a few German pictures in as well. And it created a living sense that these were the people it happened to. And I think visually it worked very strongly. Thank you very much, and I look forward to listening to the rest of you. You're next.
I just wanted to interject for 1 minute on Steve's behalf. As the emergency mediator here, Laurel, thank you for the wonderful piece. Great, but it's 30 minutes long.
Oh, no.
If I'm not
I'm so
mistaken,
sorry.
but I'd really like to keep
To my panelists.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not meaning to put you on the spot either, but
No, you should.
If everyone could keep their presentations to 10 minutes, then we'd have discussion afterwards. Thanks.
So, now that I've been reprimanded.
I'm so sorry.
I'll ask Sandra.
Thanks. Can I get the clicker?
I'll get it. Talk amongst yourselves.
I'd like to honor the memory of my late husband, James Nicholas Paustick, by showing you a few of the collaborations that he and I did together. James was Rock Cree from Nelson House, Manitoba. His mom was Sarah Linklater, a medicine woman who helped deliver more than 100 babies. And his dad was Lionel Nicholas, a trapper and a poet, who James observed writing poems on the ice of the drinking water pail before going out in the morning. James may have been the only member of the family who read them. He was a keen observer. James was an orator, a storyteller, a liaison between governments, a writer, an actor, and an artist. Many of you in this room shared a big love for James. James and I fell in love at the statue of Christopher Columbus as a boy on Clark Street in Vancouver. It was a gift from the city of Padua in Italy to the city of Vancouver. Today that space is empty. For a while, someone put a penguin on the pedestal, a penguin with sunglasses and a bow tie. That amazing night we met, with the concrete statue of the child Christopher nearby, James told stories of his own boyhood. One of the stories he told was of his dog, Smiley. When the day came for James to go away to residential school, Smiley was there with his mom and dad to see him leave on the red plane with the big pontoons. James watched them from the air as his mom and dad got smaller and smaller and smaller. And then he laughed softly, for there, swimming after the plane, was Smiley. This is a piece called I Am Appropriating You. and he won. Do you think this is an Indigenous monument? And this is from Marcia Crosby. We are in our own lives. So James and I decided we wanted to find out what happened to the Manitou stone. Does anybody know about the Manitou stone? Papa Miha Asine. This was a very sacred rock that was sacred to all the peoples of this nation, the Blackfoot, the Cree, the Saulteaux, many peoples. And I was working on the book on the internment camps in World War I. Those stories aren't told when so many Ukrainians were interned. And one of the descendants said, I know where it is. And it was in the Royal Alberta Museum. So we started to go and wander to find it and to look for it, but also to look for where it was. And on that journey, James was very tired. Sometimes the ongoingness of the ongoingness gets to be too much, hey? But here we are at Rib Rocks, this amazing place that's been surrounded by a fence. And we found the rock, and many people had been attending to the rock and leaving tobacco and offerings there. And we made this piece. And I just want to quote a little bit from Elwood Jimmy. There was a Methodist minister, his name was McDougall, and in 1866, Elwood Jimmy writes, McDougall encounters Papa Miha Asine. McDougall promptly and boldly steals Papa Miha Asine from its original site in effort to strip all vestiges of Aboriginal culture and worldview. It is moved to the farmyard of the Victoria Mission. McDougall believes that by stealing Papa Miha Asine, the First Peoples will embrace the church. It has the opposite effect. Fearing more conflict, McDougall has Papa Miha Asine taken to Winnipeg, where it is taken to Victoria, then it is taken to Victoria College in Toronto, where it is taken to the Royal Ontario Museum Vault. I do not know the truth of this is me, of this iron rock, this fallen meteor, as did my late husband Paustick, or as you do, Elwood, or as your mother does. I witnessed that James's prayers were humble. Through them, he understood Big Bear's realization that when Papa Miha Asine was stolen, the newcomer's intentions were not good. This was a turning point in the relations between those that had inherent rights to the land, your people, Elwood, and those that wanted them. I have witnessed icons of cultures and civilizations destroyed in New York and in Baghdad as attempts to break people. But this theft you speak of is different. Papa Miha Asine is not an icon. It is not a symbol. It has Pamatisuan, I never say it right, life itself. Pamatsuan, life itself, as James would tell me. It is at once animate and inanimate. How can I, a granddaughter of Ukrainian and Polish immigrants, know this as you do? How do I hear the prophecies without my mind being clouded by guilt or denial or skepticism? How do I protect myself from the truth of how white history has betrayed me, made me complicit in these terrible historical wrongs? Medicine men and elders foretell visions of plague, Elwood continues, the loss of the buffalo herds, famine, and war with the removal of Papa Miha SNA. And these things did in fact come to happen within that next decade. And this is from Jimmy Durham. This is James. He's speaking to no one at the treaty talks in Battleford, Fort Battleford. This is called Iskunigan, and it talks about the lands that were left over is what people got for reserves. And you know, James was always doing these spontaneous performances. And so he dug himself onto this little tiny piece of land surrounded by cultivated land. I always had to be fast and quick. And this is a piece called Poundmaker's Garden. And the text along the bottom is by Patrick Lowry, who was the editor of the Optimist in North Battleford in 1883, and he's speaking from, you know, that white point of view in a very paternalistic way about how beautiful Poundmaker's crops were. And James and I have an exchange in this. That's James, and that's his garden, and he planted it in circles. So I say, I'm impressed when you act like me. And I was. The only Indians to be seen were those working in their fields. And he responded to me, so act like me then. So I did. You know, when you fall in love with someone, you really want to learn by being like them. This is a piece called Confederation. So this is there in Charlottetown. This is James in the chambers, which is of course a monument of its own, right? She's coming on to him, isn't she? She is, isn't she? And this is James's text. I'm wondering why we weren't invited to the ball. This is, I'm getting close to time here. This is a piece done with my uncle and James, and it refers to that kind of inversion of generosity that an elder talked to us about. It was like that the white people turned things upside down, that it was the First Nations people who invited us onto this land and helped us to survive on this land. And then we turned it upside down, so it makes it seem like we're the generous one. And I don't know of any deeper injustice, you know, than that, because that's where the power of people is in their generosity. We make ourselves the generous one. And in this piece, my uncle is being like my Baba, serving him, and James, I really felt, was very prayerful and very respectful. And the handshake is from both cultures. This is a piece called Camperville. And he wanted to see his old teacher, Sister Carol, and so we went to where he went to residential school. And of course, this church is the monument that's still left there. And he said, I do not know the bond connecting one heart to heart to heart to heart. And he said, I feel like a guest who always has to leave home yet again. As did my father, his father and their grandfathers. And I said, I am witness. Each autumn, you wore residential school demons that took you by surprise. And he died in the autumn. Just very quickly, this is the audience, and this is the audience listening to Eric Tatousis tell the story of the attempt at massacre of the Poundmaker Cree at Cut Knife Hill. So there's a reenactment where for the first time this story is being told publicly. And it's a very powerful story. The audience as monument. And this is Irene Finday, who is the daughter, I believe, of the war chief Finday, who strategized to rout Otter's troops after they had snuck up on the camp to fire with the Gatling gun on the people at sleep in their teepees. He routed them, and they used blankets on sticks to make it seem like there was a lot more of them. One man, in order to, they snuck out of their tents. They were informed by a medicine man who heard the knocking on the poles, and they were informed by a Métis man who ran all the way to warn the Cree, but one man was stabbed as a baby to quiet him so that their lives would not be destroyed. And that man lived to tell the story. But this is Irene. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandra, and so wonderful to see James. Just, you know, we're here, it's about memory. It's about those things that we have lost. But I would just ask everybody to take a few minutes sometime today and think about somebody that you've loved that is no longer with us, and hold that memory, because I think and think good thoughts about them. So thank you, Sandra. And now I'll ask Richard Hill.
Thank you. If you're not sick of me now, you can come back tomorrow where I'll be on one more panel, and then you can be really sick of me. It's always hard preparing something in advance. I knew because I only had 10 minutes that I wanted to script something out so that I could say what I meant to say and get in as much as I could. But of course the danger of that is always that events and the things that people have already said overtake you. So I hope if we've already complicated things more than I have here, that you'll be a bit generous with me and just kind of follow along. And speaking of being preempted, Steve, I was waiting for Jen to use this quote, the quote that you used earlier. I thought it might be coming, and when she didn't, I was relieved because it was the quote that I was going to use to start my talk. And then, of course, you pulled it out of wherever you pulled it out of. And so I'm not sure now what to do, whether to say it again, just so that we can all have the experience of what happens when somebody who doesn't sound like Jimmy Durham is speaking the words of Jimmy Durham, and we can have a sense of funny dissonance and failure of representation. But here's the quote. We, you and I, must remember everything. We must especially remember those things that we never knew. Obviously, that process cannot begin with longer lists of facts. And then there's a little bit that I'll leave out. And then he says, perhaps we must trust confusion more for a while and be deeply suspicious of simple stories. And you'll say that it's just like Jimmy to give us a task that's both necessary and impossible. But of course, it's now clear that grappling with impossibility is our daily work. And that's certainly no more so the case than when we're considering the monument, which is as much a sign of the impossibility of remembering all that we must as it is anything else. And again, as Jimmy has already made, I think, very clear. I like that he asks us not simply to add new facts, but also to consider the form of our remembering. In this spirit, I want to address the question of the relationship between what sort of things we attempt to remember and the structure that remembering takes, especially the role that objects and materiality play when we create art objects on behalf of memory. I'm trusting that by the time I read this, we will be well on our way to untangling the desire to honor and remember from the monumentalizing impulse to fix the past and provide what is often, I think, only an appearance of memory that functions as an alibi concealing many losses. Too often it is an official memory, a simple story of the type Jimmy warns against. Or if it's a corrective, it adds a new fact or a new individual to the pantheon without ever asking what view of the world that fact or that individual was once entangled in, what network of social forms, language, and so forth it has now perhaps shed. Or it might be better to say that it has been pinned and fixed and it can no longer move in those networks or help us to remember them. Now I want to weave together two more elements. The first is the process of memorialization that's very common to the monument. And what I mean is I want to think, in other words, about the particular sort of remembering that we call mourning. Mourning is exactly about the failure of memory to be adequate to a loss. The second element is the role of the object and materiality in the process of mourning. When we lose people, we often try to remain connected to them by forming attachments to familiar places or through objects, especially objects which we can understand as indexical signs of the lost person. For us relatively short-lived humans, objects are time travelers, and for better and often, unfortunately, for worse, we have long known the trick of extending our own agency through them as they move through space and time. I'll give you a fairly innocent and actually quite personal example. Since the early 1990s, I've become a collector of wallets. This is a project I had thrust upon me by circumstances. Family members started dying, and I often ended up with their personal effects, including their wallets. The first was my grandfather, then not long after, in 1992, my mother. My grandfather's wallet has, in a sense, become more deeply inflected with the past that he and I shared as time makes its contents increasingly dissonant with current experience. It contains, just as a very simple example, a now fairly long defunct Canadian $1 bill, which is now surprising to see when you open the wallet. It also has a photograph of me from when I was in grade 7. My grandfather never had a camera, but I did, and I was reasonably good at that sort of thing. So I remember that I actually took the photograph for him at his request using a tripod and a timer. He wanted an image to remember me by, both in general and I suppose at that specific age. But now I'm not only the co-author of that memory, I'm also its only keeper. It's now, as you can see, a memory that is not as much about him, not as much about me as it is about him me remembering him, remembering me. My brother actually has a box of such memories that he keeps for both of us. It's a cedar chest that my dad made in shop class in high school and gave to my mom. She used it to store the memorabilia of our childhood, baby photos, toys, swaddling blankets, and that sort of thing. I suppose she imagined being an old woman and using them to help her remember our childhoods. But my mother died when she was 50, so she never got to do that. And my brother and I are once again keepers of someone else's partially unfulfilled memories of ourselves. But my mother was also memorialized more officially. She was a professor of social work at the University of Manitoba at a time when there weren't very many Indigenous professors there. And not long before she died, she was instrumental in establishing an inner-city counseling center that drew faculty and students from the School of Social Work to provide free counseling service to inner-city families. When she died, they named the center after her and hung a photo of her above the reception desk. Not long ago, the dean of the School of Social Work was in touch with my brother and I to tell us that for economic reasons, the university was no longer going to be involved in running the center, and it was going to be turned over to another social service agency. From our point of view, this struck at the heart of what the project meant to my mother, which was trying to connect a notoriously remote university to a community that it was in a position to assist. So we asked that her name be removed, and after some concern from the university regarding the signal this would send to the Indigenous community, her name was removed. We didn't want the memory of our mother pinned to the fortunes of an institution that no longer reflected her vision. It seemed better to let that memorialization end. But I'm grateful to all of you for allowing me to share these memories of her here and my memories of memories. This conversation is a good memorial for her, even if I only send just a little fragment of an image of her along with each of you today. This leads me to the way in which official projects, especially national projects, so often co-opt our relationship between things and memories. Much of Jimmy's art from the past few decades, as I think maybe you got a sense of earlier, has been aimed at the problem of how materials get scripted metaphorically on behalf of official narratives. And as you heard, the most frequent example is the ways in which church and state use metaphors of the permanence and stability of stone to prop up their own projects and conceal the real work that they're doing. So we can see that artists have a choice regarding whether to continue to use materials and metaphors in that way or to attempt to liberate them from monumentality and metaphor. All this, again, while trying to grapple with the impossibility of remembering all that we need to and the danger that the monument will help us forget the things we need to remember the most. I think an excellent example of this is the recent monument to missing and murdered Aboriginal women in Winnipeg. And I know this is a kind of emerging thing, and I may not, if someone has better information about this, you can certainly let me know later. But from what I understand, I've written what I have. And I think really that beyond the question of why an Indigenous artist was not commissioned to create it, and the fact that it looks to me like a kind of hideous monstrosity, is that it actually elides and supplants a much more active memorialization that's already underway. Christy Belcourt's extremely successful Walking with Our Sisters project. Most, probably maybe all of you, will know about this project in which over 1,300 artists across the country have been creating moccasin vamps in honor of, and I think also in outrage at, the frightening number of Indigenous women who've been murdered or gone missing. The growing collection has been traveling and has been exhibited in many communities across Canada, again, as I'm sure you know. The difference between the two projects couldn't be more jarring. One is a call to agency, action, and involvement. The other is exceedingly strange in its timing, or rather, it's being out of time. Who creates a monument before the situation being memorialized has been resolved or even properly officially addressed? Do you create a monument to the war dead during the middle of the war? Nobody does that. I suspect that the motives for the project are likely split between Indigenous sponsors who are trying to use the convention of the monument to preemptively legitimate the issue, and perhaps also the province and other forces who perhaps hope it will preemptively close it off. But wouldn't we rather be walking with our sisters than caught flat-footed in front of a hideous monument? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And being somebody who lives in Ottawa where you can't, swing a dead cat without hitting a hideous monument, we're faced with that often. It's a very strange, Ottawa's so strange on so many levels, but that's one of the strangest. They're everywhere. You can't escape them. So, yeah, one more hideous monument in the world. And actually, to be honest, That particular one in Winnipeg is not the only hideous monument in Winnipeg. For any of you who've seen the new Museum for Human Rights, which I would also argue is a hideous monument in aesthetic as well as in its philosophy. But that's another discussion we can have over beers, because now I'll invite Geir to.
Yeah. So, thank you. First of all, thank you to the Stronger Than Stone initiators and organizers, and that they give me the possibility to meet people here and learning to know the land here. Since I'm the only one from Norway here speaking, I will take you to the place I come from, and I will read my little staggery notes in my Oxford notebook here. So you have to excuse me for my lack of English knowledge. So the place I come from is Mandalen, Olmaivagi in Sami language. It's a Sami village by a fjord on the coast of northern Norway. The valley, because Olmaivagi means man's valley. It's around 20 kilometers, and the man rock that gave the name to the valley is on the brink to the mountain plateau in the southeast behind, looking north. To the west, Akkavagi, the old ladies' valley. The lady is a giant rock by the head mountain in the valley, Gaisi. Moving even more north to the plateau of Nuortanjarga, the north point. Nuorta might by the way, mean both east and north in Sami language. Looking north to the great fjord Lyngen, Ivgu, you can see all the way to the so-called North Pole behind the horizon. A childhood memory. Me and my playmates, kids from our neighborhood by the sea, seeking shelter under a boat, probably a left-back dory from the net fisheries for herring or coalfish, saite, seidi, sei. We were laying there in our 70s synthetic outdoor wear, feeling the heat from each other, in fear for German soldiers attacking us and our families. The fear was in our bodies 30 years after, for real. April 1945. German soldiers burned down and damaged every house, barn, shed, turf house, piers, bridges in my home village. People of the valley was deported already during the autumn before. The Germans, going back from the east front in the north, didn't want to leave any infrastructure for the Soviet troops coming after them. And they needed food. So all animals, sheep, cows, and horses were killed. Our local breed of Lyngen horse, it's an ancient pony, was almost extincted. Some people even fled into the mountains, staying in turf houses and caves. Some fled over the border to Sweden, but most people were deported. The Nazi called it evacuated to the southern areas. My grandmother had heard rumors that we were going to be extincted too, like the Jews, so she sent her children to survive in the mountains. My grandmothers got new houses built in the early 50s, modern houses designed by architects from the south after Norwegian standards, giving people opportunities to get housing loans. In those kitchens, my parents' generation decided to not teach us Sami language, to prepare us for modern life. not to be attached to the past poverty and suppression. New times were to come. The Norwegian authorities had already prepared the ground with the colonial power through schools administration and southern ignorance and arrogance. When I attended school in 1974, almost no teachers were local. They were southerners. One teacher, Magne Michaelsen, a man old as my mother, he was a local. But he were bringing false Norse history, I remember. But later he gave classes in Sami language, 1 hour a week in the 80s. He early got Alzheimer's disease. In the 70s, the income rates in Norway was many doubled. The oil economy was rising. Free education was offered, and the North Norwegian University of Tromsø was established. Now the distribution of academic education boosted. I was the first one in my family that went to high school. I wouldn't be here if it were not for because of the oily money from the North Sea and the Norwegian Sea. In May 1991, Håkon Eriksen, a younger guy in my home village, addressed me. He and some of his fellows wanted to arrange some Sami culture days, and they wanted me to make the poster. The poster I made was the satellite image from the Tromsø satellite station of our area, with a drawing of a Riebangardi, a kid's play with the tracks in snow, of a fox corral in which the bear is chasing the fox. I also put the text Jagi vai Beivi, years or days, on the top of it. So I thought, shouldn't every day be a cultural day? This drawing is now the logo for the famous indigenous peoples festival Riddu Riddu, taking place in the village every summer. Now the festival is a year-round institution. There is a Northern Peoples Center and many offices for different Sami institutions there. The village school is offering Sami language classes as standard, and there is a Sami kindergarten called Riebangardi nearby. And next month, the Riddu Riddu Festival and the Northern Peoples Center takes me to Taimyr Peninsula in Siberia. Yeah, and that's for another indigenous peoples gathering. I'm old now. My hips hurt and it's hard to walk. I'm visiting my nephew's daughter that just got a son. They live in the house my grandmother got built and that I grew up in. The once bright colors of the house are fading. The potato field is full of vegetables, and there is a lot of berries in the garden. But it seems hard to make a living. I don't know if the parents can afford to have the little boy in the Riebangardi kindergarten, or if it does exist at all. My eyes are dry. I don't know if I should laugh or cry. In the cradle, my great-grand-nephew does the both. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And our final panelist today, Marcia. Take as much time as you want. Don't listen to Wayne.
Some of you might know that if you're from the Northwest Coast, you have to stand up. I grew up with my grandfather in my grandparents' house, and it didn't even matter if there was a few people for dinner, he'd stand up and give a speech. So I just thought that's what you did. Guljat Ganga, all you boss women. Gilsly Ganga, all you big men. Di Tashwalanganga, all my friends and relatives, my community. What a gift, what a gift. What an amazing, something I never, ever dreamed of, or if I did, I'd forgotten the dream and I got to wake up in it. Thank you. Thank you to the organizers and the visionaries and the dreamers for dreaming this time for us to be together and to do this work. And all the really, really, really patient support people that do the tickets and answer all the endless questions and all those sorts of things. I'm really grateful. The work that you're looking at is, this is, I'm not going to say much, but it comes from a section of my doctoral thesis, and you'll understand it as you go along. And what you'll see up here are images that I found online from newspapers, fiction books, like fiction, but most of it's more like creative nonfiction, sort of like travel literature, anything I found, and I thought would go with what I had, I used, because it works for me. So feel free to make any associations you want between text, image, voice. Okay, are we ready?
1894, The Passion Play. Weird scenes in the wilds of British Columbia. Hartford Herald, KY.
Kentucky.
December 19th, there are a series of striking tableaux, 9 in number. A procession is formed by the spectators. First the men of one tribe chanting an old French hymn in their Indian languages, their rich male voices resounding in the open air. Next come the women of the same tribe, singing also, without any regard to the different tribe following behind. The next tribe sings that chant in their own language, and so on, with the 4 or 5 following. The procession keeps in constant movement in the little arena before the stage while the tableaux go on. Over 2,000 strong voices ring out with the ancient Passion hymn, each eye cast devoutly upon the changing tableau enacted upon the small stage before them. At the final scene, the wax figure of the Savior, elevated on a cross from the platform. By a mechanical contrivance, what represented blood was made to trickle from the wounds in the head, hands, feet and sides, while at the foot of the cross was the Virgin Mary, her black hair flowing down her back and bitter grief expressed in every movement. 1 minute, 27 seconds. Among the people of British Columbia, red, white, yellow and brown. Travel literature by Francis Herring, published 1903. 1893, our day was occupied in the rancherie, with religious services in preparation for the celebration of the Great Passion Play, which is only given when the Indians have succeeded in building a church for themselves. On Monday, all the Indians must leave on the train and steamboats, chartered to carry them to their different reserves. Now, there would have been 1,000 more at this gathering, had they been able to come from Kamloops and the upper country. That is, even though, on previous occasions the CPR had carried all the Indians for 1 cent a mile, when traveling for religious purposes. This time, the railway demanded half fare. Unfortunately, this last fishing season was a very poor year for the Indians, and even worse, when many of them had returned to their reserves, they found their potato crops had rotted. So, then they had to spend the winter camped near the towns, where they might pick up a little work, or the women could sell their baskets and curios. 1 minute 20 seconds.
Mr. McBride made the statement that we Indians were well satisfied with our position and that the present agitation among us was fomented by certain whites. We deny this statement. We can tell you all the promises broken if you want to know, and we can prove them through witnesses still living. What of Governor Seymour's promise made to the Lower Fraser Indians who convened at his request, purposely to hear his message to them concerning the proposed policy of the whites towards the Indians of this country? They rank with the other early promises, all broken. This is enough to show that there is a sufficient reason for our dissatisfaction, and also that it required no white man to point out these things to us and to urge us to be dissatisfied.
Did not other great men of the province, in early days, state to us that the whites had come here to help us and be brothers to us? Why then should Mr. McBride denounce what his predecessors, and we believe also the Queen, said was the right thing to do? We have learned that the whites do not keep their word, especially when it is not written word. Only those very few whites who help us appear to be trying to keep the white man's promises made to us by the white chiefs in the early days. They alone appear to uphold the honor of their race. Thus, we assure you, the present agitation among us over these matters is simply the culmination of our dissatisfaction, which has been growing with the years. Among the people of British Columbia, red, white, yellow, and brown. Chapter 11. Written by Francis Herring. At the cottage of the chief, on the doorstep, there is a pleasant squaw of large proportions. In her arms, not in a basket, we see a very much wrapped up bundle, and within it, the placid face of an infant. We ask, how old? Looking up at us, 7 days, she answers softly, as she gently jogs the baby to and fro. At once, I remember, we had seen this same squaw, kneeling at the station of the crucifixion, on the damp ground, listening intently, as she sighed in sorrow for her Lord. Following our visit, we were told that one of her sons, only 10 days ago, had been killed in the explosion in New Westminster. "15,000 miles by stage." Travel literature written by Carrie Adele Strayhorn. The summer of 1893, about 100 Indians, who lived on the Lillooet chain of lakes, gathered around an appointed spot for a potlatch, which seemed to be given in a sense of gratitude for their good behavior. Yet, the fundamental reason might have been traced to the usual cause, that is, no Indian who drinks liquor will be employed at the fisheries, and the watchman in charge of them is held responsible for their good behavior. The potlatch was a reward of merit to them. The Kluchmen were dressed in their most bewitching attire, and sat outside the circle of braves, having no share in the potlatch excepting what the bucks chose to give them. Later, a cornet band composed of 20 or more young buck Indians began playing Home Sweet Home. Could anything have been more thoughtful, more delicately planned and executed than this sunrise serenade with our own beloved national airs by these natives of the forest?
Mr. McBride also said, the Indians share in enjoying the advantages arising from building of railroads, wagon roads, trails, and other government utilities. Perhaps we do, but have we not assisted in building them? And have they not been built up from the direct robbery of ourselves and our country? We can claim these are rightfully ours, and yet we are made to pay for using them. Have we never assisted in the making of these railways and roads? Had this government paid us for all our timber that was used and all our 50 millions of gold taken out of this country and all our salmon that has been caught and destroyed and many other things which might be mentioned that went into the making of these roads? Have we been paid even a small share of all this wealth, mostly derived from the destruction in most cases, not the improvement of our country? Or had the country been bought from us? So it were actually the property of the whites to destroy or do with as they pleased, then and only then the British Columbia government might speak of our sharing in the benefits of roads, which they infer we are in no way entitled.
(1893), a passion play by British Columbia Indians in an illustrated magazine. The leading members of the coast tribes assembled in front of the convent, upon the steps of which stood the dignitaries, with Ermineskin as the central figure. Near him was Alexander Strongman. Chief Henry, of the Squamish tribe, read the address of welcome, it being translated into the Cree language by Father Lacombe, into French by Father Marigel, and into Chinook by Father Chirouse. Replies were made by Ermineskin and Alexander Strongman through an interpreter. Chief Henry also replied, reciprocating the kindly sentiments of Ermineskin. 48 seconds.
Sorry. I don't mean to keep doing that. A few of the reserves may appear large on paper, but most consist chiefly of more or less barren side hills, rock slides, timbered bottoms that are hard to clear, and arid flats devoid of water for irrigation. Either the land or the water is lacking. In many places, even the total acreage of the reserves is exceedingly small. All parts of all reserves known to us are used by us, one way or another, as fully as possible. Now, if by occupancy Mr. McBride means actually living on or cultivating each part of reserves, then we plead guilty to our inability to occupy the greater part of them. For we cannot live on and cultivate rocks, nor side hills and places where we can get no water. Even in the many places that we do occupy fully and cultivate continually, in fact, we lose our crops altogether or in part every year owing to whites taking the irrigation water or stopping us from using them.
*MC, while the celebration, the Passion Play, is a religious one, There was not the slightest objection to personal adornment. Many of the Indians were picturesquely togged out in bright garments and glaring war paint. Compared with these were the simple vestments of the priests. Then, the highly colored dresses of the Kluchmans and children in the other extreme. There were 100 Indians mounted on ponies in a cavalcade, and, immediately behind the priests, the largest mission brass band followed them. Then came the banner bearers, carrying the insignia of the various tribes. From the Skeena River to the Kokoluskas in the eastern Kootenai, to the sons of the warlike races that formerly inhabited Idaho and Washington state. Then, another brass band and the main body of the visiting Indians from the coast and upper country followed.
The red men of the various tribes strove to outdo their rivals. In the glory of their equipment and furnishings, the women and the children then came last. Immense dugout canoes, brilliantly painted and comprising the finest handiwork of the races, were borne in a big parade. After passing several times around the grounds, the Indians were halted, and again addresses were given in several languages. Christian chiefs, clad in untanned skin robes, gathered in a circle immediately in front of the bishop and were especially blessed. In the evening, the presentation of valuable gifts between the tribes took place. Thousands of dollars worth of goods of all descriptions, from blankets to tables and farm utensils and trinkets, were given away by the tribesmen to one another. The Passion Play itself, the feature which has attracted this vast gathering of red men, will be presented on Friday. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you, everybody. I think we have, how much time do we have for? Okay, so I'll immediately open it up to the floor because I've taken up so much time that we're over. So if anybody has any questions or comments. Oh, there you are. Okay, this is me also reminding you to introduce yourselves when you ask your question, so we know who you are and we can chase you down later. Raymond.
I really appreciate how so many of the presentations tie together the fact that so many all histories demand that they are multiply narrated, and I wonder if anyone might have any sort of thoughts about how history or histories might come to embody Indigenous cultural imperatives. Is there some kind of like methodological path through that actually might make histories more legible?
More what?
More legible for Indigenous people?
Yeah, that we write them. I think we had this chat last night, right? It was like, you write your MA or write whatever you write and publish it quickly, because people will quote you with whatever if your dissertation's sitting around in some place, but if you don't do your own work, make sure you get it published. Don't go for perfection. Get it done. Not like I have, but it is the main thing. It is the main thing. And no one will ever think like you. And when I first started my work, I ran into this place where it was like, oh my God, somebody wrote all this already or whatever. And then, but no one puts together the material that you find, and nothing will jar their memories the way it jars yours. And that's what I found with all these histories. Some of them are hard to read because you have to really look up like things like Squaw, Kluchman, and all that kind of stuff, you know. But really, when you start, even those most, I wouldn't say reprehensible, but you know, don't feel good to look at, they all provide you with so much information and wealth, and you can start working with all of those bits and pieces. So left off official histories and even writing an official history and just started to piece things together from what was public, not official history, but what everybody was saying, you know, everywhere in the world through the British Empire and that sort of thing. Film, any kind of media, images, postcards. It's been great. So there's so much work to do.
Somebody else want to respond to that as well?
I could try. As a lot of people here know, I'm a failed artist and have been quite successful at failing at being an artist. But I, in a way, I have maybe two ways of answering that question. Then basically, and one is a kind of art answer, and one is from my work with historical objects. And you might also know that I'm not a properly trained art historian either, although I've worked with historical collections as well as contemporary art. I think that the question of how to deal with history goes far outside the question of the monument. And I think, in a way, in many cases, my first attempt to grapple with that was through the work of Carl Beam, actually. Jimmy also certainly was very important, but I think the kind of ways of trying to represent history that artists took on, really in the absence of having the history published that Marcia is talking about, was really important. And many of those early works, I think, really addressed, again, a kind of problem of the form of how you proceed, as much as adding different content or even different imperatives or things like that. And so I always look to that kind of multi-layering of Carl Beam, or the kind of problems that Jimmy put around the question of historical representation. And then I guess, and again, I don't think I've ever added any clarity to any questions around indigenous objects, but what my encounter with historical objects has been often is has been an invitation to interrogate my own ignorance in a way, because I find that it's very easy to think you know a lot, and that when you encounter an object that is from your cultural heritage, and it's opaque to you in some way, and it has mystery to it, it's very humbling, but also really fascinating. And so I've struggled with those objects and tried to make sense of them. I don't feel like I've done anything that will necessarily add clarity, but I think that's really the relationship I see to working with history. But again, I work with history in a not direct way often. Sorry, I think I really not answered your question.
No, I think it's good in the sense that, like the Jimmy Durham quote concerning confusion, to think of how confusion can be productively deployed, that it's, there's a certain value judgment that's maybe tied to confusion, that to actually give it some other way of operating, I think is really useful. So to, hear this machine speaking these words, along with you speaking these words as well, I think that multiply narrated history, or like in your story about the wall, it's how a memory itself changes shape. It's like, I think there's some confusion there.
Thanks for that, and you forgot to introduce yourself, so none of that counts. I'm withdrawing the question and the answers. Anybody else? I know it's been a long day.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank all the speakers and the moderation. Well done. My name is Ayimi Gota, and I have recently moved to Okanagan Territory. I've just been there for about a year. And I've been thinking about this idea of monuments, and in particular, the title for this panel, Your History is Not My Memory. And I know very, very little about Okanagan history, myths, and I'm reminded of that every day when when Jimmy Durham was talking about his walking practice. Every day I cross over a bridge that connects Kelowna to West Kelowna, and as soon as you cross the bridge, you hit the West Bank First Nation. And in the West Bank First Nation side, as soon as you hit that, right in the road is a Na'aitk, which is Ogopogo, and it's carved into the road. And I see this as a monument by the Okanagan people to Na'aitk, which is non-human, and it seems to exceed human intentionality, but it seems to create a reach beyond human endeavor. And the reason I think about this is that I grew up in a very multilingual Asian-speaking environment where there was Cantonese, Mandarin, Cambodian, Vietnamese, Japanese, and Korean spoken, and I could only speak Japanese and English. So there's a lot of talk and a lot of conversations that just pass through me. And every day as I go and pass by this monument to Na'aitk, it reminds me that that which sometimes are unspeakable, that which I cannot know, and that which I didn't stop to consider because of not knowing. And I want to know if you see this. I see it in Sandra when you're talking about your work with James in the Manitou Stone, this idea of the monument that exceeds that human history, and how that can link to a different kind of memory making that exceeds colonization as well. Thank you.
And a different, say that last sentence again.
Yeah, the last sentence.
So just the difference between, so a lot of the monuments we're talking about are historical human figures. And I think of the Ogopogo or Na'aitk and the monuments that are there in the everyday, should we look or should we take a notice? And Jordan Coble, who's the director of the West Bank First Nation art repository in the Heritage Museum there, had said in a public gathering that an elder had told to him that we should consider Okanagan Lake as Na'aitk, and it seems to exceed time, human time, and I see that seems to be the work that I don't know very much about Manitou Stone that you're working on, but also just how do we conceive, like, and this is for all of the panelists, how do we conceive of the monument as a reach toward beyond human experience?
Well, that's huge, what you're asking. I think Elwood Jimmy might be here. Is he? Because Elwood is a really good person to talk about the rock, but I'll talk about it briefly from what he has spoken to me and others have spoken to me, and that is that the stone is not regarded as inanimate. It's animate. It's alive. Pimatsuin, and James and I did a lot of work where we extended the work into the more than human in conversation, and that work is ongoing. And I mean, part of the teaching for me was to begin to understand the all my relations understanding of the world in a different way than my own Ukrainian culture understood it, and it's very profound to begin to get an inkling of that. So I can hear what you're saying, that being on that territory, you want to be able to connect with that understanding to begin to know the land, and I respect what you're saying.
I was thinking about the Hutsik Rock, there was the story with it, but in order to protect it, they had to speak about the unspeakable. They had to name it, which wasn't something that they had ever done historically. But so I think people are always determining what they will name and what they will speak about. Who does get to stand up and speak for all the murdered women, and who really who you want to see it, but who would dare to? You know, it's a big thing where you have to join forces with people. And even in my own project, because I'm related to so many people, I'm Haida Semchuk, and we intermarried with so many people, and I wanted it to be about living in an urban space, but of course then it encompasses the Coast Salish and the Squamish. A lot of my relatives are intermarried there. So I believe that you can make, I think of monuments as making words and making history and making our own histories available. And so there is a possibility for me to speak about these histories by using all of these public sources and always being careful that I don't talk about things I shouldn't talk about. One of them is spirit things. But even still, sometimes in the most public places, you know, like most people really don't care, but if you have a strategy for how you're going to approach making monumental histories or making available histories that we wouldn't have been able to find otherwise, those things can talk. Because the fact is that these things, I don't know how, I wasn't Catholic, but I am sure that the images of all those priests standing around must trigger something for somebody. And you trigger it differently. So that if 4 of you got together and said, I couldn't stand seeing the priest standing there, and another one says, oh, you begin to talk together, and pretty soon those individual memories become partially homogenized. And it's in that process that we begin to make, like we're doing here, we start to make common histories by talking about the things that we know about and memories that overlap each other. And that's not like through necessarily institutional, but I think seeing this way of making these histories that we know people don't know enough about move through the public, through public institutions, just by the way we live every day, and we talk about these things. That's a monumental thing to do, to make, and I don't know if the woman is here yesterday, and she was saying, you know, a woman that talked about being an artist in her a resistor. What was that comment yesterday? No, it wasn't Rebecca. It was a young. And she says, "Well, how am I supposed to resist all of this?" And you know, and remember her? And she said, "Oh, I'm just in my." And I thought, as soon as somebody sees your work and has something to say about it, then you'll know. You know, if you don't know now, the time will come when people will look at your work and resist it. Don't worry. If you're an Indian and you're making work, it'll happen.
I'm Wayne Bearwalt. Laurel, I just wanted to call upon you again, maybe just to talk a bit about what you're looking at now. You're dealing with a group in Grand Forks, North Dakota, who want to erect monuments. And I just thought it was a very interesting way for you to intervene with knowledge, with a base of knowledge that they didn't seem to have access to or didn't respect before you made contact. So that you could comment on that.
Oh my, I'll be quick. I was asked to head up Public Arts Commission, and I didn't want to do it because I didn't know how to do it or what to do. It was started by a group of businessmen, and they want to put a lot of sculptures along this corridor. And it seemed just impossible to me, and so I've been trying to bring people like yourselves in to talk about how visual language can carry ideas or feelings that we don't need words for. And I don't know if I'll be successful or not, I don't even know. But it's very difficult. And I also have to think about time and how long will this piece be of value to people. That's not an answer, but it's some of the things I'm worrying about.
And I think I'll give the last question to Tennis. No, microphone.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Again, with my confusion, the Western concepts of monument to me seems like the period at the end of a sentence, right? And then you know, we recognized it, it's done, move on. And then we talk about what that monument is commemorizing after the monument's been built in past tense. So it was, or it used to be. And so then just because the monument's been built, we start speaking in a concept of linear time, which is a Western concept of time. And I think in looking at monuments, we're looking at memory and time. And if we're looking at memory and time, then we need to look at the land as testament to our memory and concepts of time. And so I'm wondering if the panelists could speak to the possibility of land being monument versus object as monument. Miigwech.
That's a great question, and I think I'll ask each one of them to respond to, because I think that's really important, and then that can kind of be your final words as well. So I'll start with Laurel.
Yes, I think absolutely the land is monument for many of us. I lived under the Devil's Heart, which is a hill, but a mountain in a child's world. And it's as live and real as any object could ever be.
Thank you. Sandra?
I've been working on a book on the internment camps in World War I, so I did go to each of the sites where the 24 camps were across Canada, you know, where more than 8,000 people were interned and forced to labor. And it was really interesting to simply stand on that land. It was why I went. I wanted to stand on the land where the internees had stood, where they had labored. I think there's something about memory and being on the land that is so profound, more profound than any object, I think. And the reason why I did this project was that James and I had simply been driving along by Castle Mountain, and we saw the statue there with its hand out saying why. And we walked in and there were thousands of mushrooms. They were pink and red, and they were huddled together, and they were forming this community. And we were so moved, you know, that we stayed overnight. We camped and went in and photographed the next day. And so that kind of, like, it was like the voices were there in the land. Somehow the voices were there in the land.
Thank you, Sandra. Richard?
I was composing an answer while you were talking, and then, of course, it all disappeared into my whatever end-of-day brain or whatever it was. I guess, boy, it seems like there's so many kind of critical questions embedded in that question about what we're trying to deal with here, and maybe also that are going to kind of, as we get to know each other and talk more over the next few days, will kind of emerge as actually real differences in terms of how we think about these things. But I guess for now, in my conciliatory sort of way, when I try to summarize all my encounters with many different lands and landscapes, or whatever we want, however we want to characterize them, there are certainly spaces that are very powerful sources of memory for me. I'm not sure that any of them constitute monuments. I'd have to think more about that. But certainly there are places that are important repositories of memory. At the same time, I feel really strongly that the other thing that I love about being on the land is that there's familiarity and surprise also. So that I'm not, I hate the idea of going out to the land to find the thing that you already know, and have, you know, the danger of, because I've moved around a lot all my life, and there are places that I go to all the time nostalgically, and on one hand I get that kind of hit of a feeling of a connection to a lost world, you know, because the people are gone who made up the world of my childhood by and large, and I I go for that to get it. But of course, it's an extremely dangerous thing to go just to try and to find what you already know is going to be there. And one of the the last art project that I tried to do when I was a kid, my grandparents had a cattle ranch in the interior of BC. It was the last place up this mountain road, this logging road that went up. There might be a car that would drive by every month and a half or something on this road. It was quite isolated, and it was really in a valley, so you were surrounded on all sides by forest. And this was a really important space to me. It built one of my first senses of how space works, that it's a kind of clearing in the woods surrounded by mountains. And my grandfather sold that ranch when I was quite young, and we went away, and I've kept it in my mind for a long time, and I wanted to try to, as an art project, as a kind of Super 8 film, go back and film that space over the course of a day, from sunrise to sunset, but by going around the perimeter and filming inward. And I actually had some film of my grandparents stringing the barbed wire fence around the property originally, and I thought I could use that and just set up my camera with a stop motion or a timer so that it would kind of do this, time lapse film and simply move it around and look at from the outside. And I learned two things. I spent the whole day by myself just looking into this space that I hadn't been back into for years. And I learned, first of all, that my recollection of it was vastly simplified and distorted. Nothing was spatially the way I imagined it. But I also was constantly fascinated by the kind of stuff that was just in front of me while I was waiting. And I wasn't just watching that. There was just the immediacy of what was before me. And I guess if I've taken a long time to say a fairly simple thing, when I go out onto the land, I'm happy to recognize familiar things, and I'm probably at least as happy or more happy to be surprised by new things as well.
Thank you, Richard. And I mean, you're a professor. It's your job to take a lot of time to say simple things. So, isn't that the gig?
You guys are getting off easy compared to my students.
Guys, 3 hours left. Geir?
Thank you, Richard, for all those words. Somehow I'm not into monuments. Maybe it's because of I was brought up in this tradition of leave no tracks, leave no traces. And I almost said, every step you take is monumental, or every breath you take. Maybe that's too big. But I think, and I know there are many artists here, and I'm an artist too, and I think it's so much about taking care, and taking care of the land, wherever you are. And I think it is a lot to do about work, to find a way out of this kind of the situation where we are trapped into Western art history and institutional formalities. So that's the big work, I think.
Thank you, Geir. Marcia?
I was thinking about the people from the Katsis who lived up at Pitt River originally, and how they had to move after all the deaths in 1862, and so many groups were, there were many problems, but they all had to leave, and they had to leave their place, and they journeyed to this new place on the, on the Fraser River. And as they journeyed, they paid attention to this new landscape. So they weren't just leaving the land behind. They were going into a new one, and they were going into a new one at a time when it had also, like the old, the cultivated places were gone. Places where people had once lived or gathered resources, so they were grown over. So they made new histories. They made new songs. They told new spirit stories and made new myths that were informed by the ones that they left behind. But I'm not talking about hybridity, and I'm not talking about syncretism. it's talking about the fact that we have to, like people renew. We have to renew. How will we approach the Fraser River now that they've pretty well, you know, with all the destruction that's going on in British Columbia? What's going to happen if the gas line goes through to Prince Rupert? I haven't eaten fish since Fukushima. Other people do, but I'm just saying that we are always, I agree with you, we're always renewing. I love going home because I'm going home. I love going to the north. I like going to my father's place, which is in Haida Gwaii, but I love Vancouver because I raised my kids here, and I know that they love going home to where I came from, but Vancouver's their home, you know, and so the land, it does speak to people, and you become part of that. You take care of that land when you're there. That's the only place you can do anything is where you are, because I can't go up north. So, yeah, just that it changes, and I just think that we just keep. There's all this fantastic theory about change and everything, but we just keep changing, and we have to adjust pretty quickly to what's going on. So.
Thank you, Marcia. And I'd really like to thank, well, me. You know, Steve, you stepped in, you know, when we needed somebody, and, you know, I just can't convey how impressed I am with the job you did. So I'd just like to give myself a round of applause. Yeah, fantastic panel. Laura, Sandra, Richard, Geir, Marcia, please help me.
You got it.
Somebody need to do some housekeeping stuff, like where we're going to drink and things like that?
Where are we going? Are you saying something?
We will not be drinking in the IKG, unfortunately. But we are invited to go to the Glenbow Museum. Jeff Thomas's curated exhibition of photographs from the residential school experience are there. The exhibition is there on the 4th floor. It's an amazing exhibition. Please join us for that. We should go, I would say after 6, so from 6 till the gallery closes at 7:30 tonight. So please feel welcome to come, and hopefully Jeff is there, I hope, to say a few words. It would be wonderful for that to happen. So thanks again. We hope to see you all tomorrow morning, if not tonight, and we will carry on. So, and Steve, fantastic job. Ah.
Noon from here to Saskatoon. There's room for a couple of people who want to improvise and go on for the second half. So leaving from here at noon tomorrow. Thanks. Come see me at the reception right now. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Trevor.